On March 12th, Iran's new supreme leader issued his very first public statement. What he said left no room for interpretation. Ayatollah Mojtaba Khomeini, 56, appointed just 3 days earlier after his father was killed in U.S.-Israeli strikes on February 28th, delivered a message, delivered not in person, but through a state TV anchor reading his written statement aloud while a still photograph was displayed on screen. No video, no audio of the new leader at all. His words, as reported, the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz must continue, and it will not stop until every American military base in the region is shut down or destroyed. And Trump's response, the response of the commander of the most powerful military force on earth, was that he is disappointed. That single word is now being studied in every foreign ministry, trading floor, and military planning room from Washington to Beijing to Riyadh, because what it signals, whether intentional or not, is that Washington does not yet have a clean, immediate answer to what Iran's new leadership just declared in public for the first time. Iranian officials confirmed that Mojtaba Khomeini was wounded in the same strike that killed his father. An official said Wednesday he is alive and well. That has not been independently verified. No one in the world has seen Mojtaba Khomeini publicly since the war began. That ambiguity about his actual condition, his location, and who is truly directing decisions inside Iran right now is one of the most underreported variables of this entire conflict. The U.S. Treasury sanctioned him in 2019 as part of the supreme leader's inner circle. He is considered a hardliner, even by Iranian standards, with documented deep ties to the IRGC. What changed with his appointment is not Iran's strategic objectives. Those have been consistent for years. What changed is the institutional willingness to state them in writing, publicly, through the IRGC's own media apparatus, with no visible off-ramp and no back-channel signal attached. Iran's parliament speaker confirmed separately this week that Iran is definitely not seeking a ceasefire. The IRGC spokesman added that Tehran, not Washington, will determine when this war ends. Those are not negotiating positions. They are doctrine declarations, and they describe a conflict that neither side has yet found a mechanism to exit. Here is a confirmed operational picture of what is happening to shipping in and around the Strait of Hormuz on day 13. 2 tankers caught fire in Iraqi territorial waters near Basra. One of them was a U.S.-owned crude carrier. India's Director General of Shipping confirmed the method of attack. A white, unmanned speedboat packed with explosives rammed the vessel from the starboard side. Iranian state broadcaster described the operation as underwater drones. Iraqi port officials reported explosive-laden surface vessels. The accounts differ on the exact weapon type. Either way, the method is low cost, nearly invisible on radar, and requires no aircraft or warship to deploy. A T-flagged cargo ship was set ablaze 11 nautical miles north of Oman. More than a dozen vessels have been struck in or near the strait since February 28th, according to ongoing maritime tracking. The attacks are not random acts of retaliation. They are deliberate, escalating in both geographic range and frequency, targeting the commercial logic of the waterway rather than military assets. An Atlantic Council analyst told CBS News directly, Iran can strike ships anywhere in the Gulf without minding the strait at all. That capacity is precisely why U.S. warships have not yet entered the waterway, even as commercial vessels sit anchored on both sides, waiting. Iran has not declared a formal naval blockade. What it has done is something more operationally effective by systematically striking commercial vessels. It triggered a response from the shipping industry that no formal declaration could have produced. Here is the dimension most daily coverage treats as a footnote. Within days of the war starting, major war risk insurers pulled coverage entirely for the Persian Gulf. Norway's Gard and Skuld, UK-based P&I Clubs. London's P&I Club and the New York-based American Club all exited the market. The exit was not gradual. It was coordinated, rapid, can total, across every major underwriting desk that matters for international maritime trade. Without war risk coverage, no captain can legally transit. Right? Does not matter how many U.S. destroyers are visible on the horizon. Right? No insurance means no movement. Right? That is how international maritime law functions. The benchmark freight rate for the very large crude carriers that move Gulf oil to China surged to an all-time record of $423,360 per day, according to shipping data, a 94% jump in a single weekend. That number is not a market pricing in risk, okay? That is a market signaling that transit has become effectively impossible under current conditions. Halima Croft, global head of commodity strategy at RBC Capital Markets, described the mechanism to CNN directly. All Iran had to do was several drone strikes near the strait, and insurers decided transit was unsafe. Iran needed no naval blockade, no successful mine laying. It only needed to raise perceived risk above the threshold where insurance and commercial logic would close the strait automatically. But that threshold turned out to be lower than almost anyone had modeled before February 28th. The economic closure came first, before any physical barrier existed in the water. Iran's military command issued a statement via Reuters on Wednesday, stating, "Not 1 liter of oil will get through. Expect oil at $200 per barrel." That is a formal public declaration, not a back-channel signal. Markets responded on Thursday. Brent crude surged back above $100 per barrel, despite the record 400 million barrel reserve release announced the previous day by the IEA and more than 30 governments. Analysts published a note with a clear conclusion. The only mechanism that will sustainably lower oil prices is tankers physically moving through the strait again. Reserve releases by weeks, not months. This week produced a specific sequence that tells you more about Washington's real options than any formal statement has. The U.S. Energy Secretary posted on social media that the Navy had successfully escorted an oil tanker through the Strait of Hormuz. Oil prices dropped on the news. Then the White House contradicted him. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt confirmed on record that the post was simply wrong. No escort had occurred at any point. The Energy Department blamed staff for an incorrectly captioned clip. The post was deleted. Prices reversed and rose again within hours. That sequence, a false reassurance, a market reaction, a public correction from the White House podium, tells you more about Washington's real options than any formal statement does. The confirmed operational reality as of March 13th is this. The Navy is not escorting tankers. All U.S. military assets in the region are focused on striking Iran's infrastructure, not on protecting the same waterway simultaneously. Energy Secretary Chris Wright told CNBC on Thursday, "It can't happen now. We're simply not ready." He said escorts might begin by the end of this month at the earliest. That gap between Trump promising the Navy would escort tankers as soon as possible and Wright admitting 2 weeks later it still cannot happen is not a communications problem. It is a confirmed operational constraint. Iran appears to understand this constraint precisely. No formal blockade is needed. Missile strikes, drone boats, the threat of mines, and collapsed insurance produce the same economic result at far lower costs and with far less exposure to American military retaliation. The economic numbers on the ground as of March 13th are no longer projections. They are data already in the market. The IEA warned that global oil supply could fall by as much as 8 million barrels per day in March alone as shipping through Hormuz slows to a fraction of its normal volume. Brent crude was approximately $73 per barrel when the war started on February 28th. By this week, it surged above $100, a rise of roughly 38% in under 2 weeks. At one point, prices briefly spiked toward $120 before pulling back, according to tracking of the Hormuz crisis. Iraq cut output by 1.5 million barrels per day, running out of storage capacity for crude it cannot export. Urea fertilizer prices are already up 35% since February 28th, according to Time magazine, a figure that flows directly into global food production costs. Gas prices in San Francisco reached $6.50 per gallon this week. The national average gas price hit $3.41 per gallon in the first week of the war, a jump of 43 cents in 7 days, according to AAA. U.S. crude logged its biggest weekly gain on record in data going back to 1983, in week 1 alone. There is a word that most coverage of this war is not saying out loud. Every serious economist covering this conflict is already writing it in their client notes. That word is stagflation. When inflation rises and economic growth slows simultaneously, it is the scenario central banks dread above all others. The tools that fight inflation make slow growth worse. The tools that stimulate growth make inflation worse. Okay? There is no clean policy option available. That is the corner the Federal Reserve is now standing in. The Fed entered this war already carrying a problem. Inflation was running at 2.4% annually in January, above the 2% target before a single strike had been launched against Iran. Then, in the same week the war began, the U.S. labor market delivered its worst monthly report in a year. Unemployment ticked up to 4.4% in February. The economy was showing stress before the oil shock arrived. Mark Zandi, chief economist at Moody's, told CNBC this week that consumers are being hammered by the oil surge and said directly, if oil holds near $100 per barrel, inflation will accelerate, cutting into purchasing power, hitting spending, GDP, and jobs simultaneously. Gregory Dacko, chief economist at EY Parthenon, wrote that the war raises risks on both sides of the Fed's dual mandate simultaneously. No policy response fixes one problem without worsening the other. Joe Bruce Wallace, chief economist at RSM, stated plainly, the risk of stagflation permeates the outlook. All eyes are now on energy prices as the single determining variable. San Francisco Fed President Mary Daly told CNBC that higher gas prices paired with inflation, already above target, create a genuinely challenging environment for Americans. The 10-year Treasury yield climbed above 4.17%, a move that directly pushes mortgage rates for tens of millions of homeowners. The average 30-year fixed mortgage rose from 5.99% on February 27th to 6.29% by March 12th, to 30 basis points in 2 weeks, paid monthly by people who were not expecting it. Diane Swank, chief economist at KPMG, published a scenario analysis describing a butterfly effect, small shifts in a fragile system producing outsized and unpredictable consequences. In her base case, with the war ending by late March, core inflation still spikes to 3.3% by year-end, GDP growth dips below 2%, and rate cuts are pushed to early 2027 at the earliest. In her extended scenario, with the war running for months, core inflation hits 4.1%, a level not seen since May 2023. GDP falls to 1% growth in the third quarter, and the Fed is effectively sidelined for the year. Bloomberg Economics framed it directly. For Europe, sustained high oil prices push the economy to the brink of recession. For the U.S., it places the Fed in what they call an impossible position. Chatham House noted this week that central banks are haunted by the 1970s, when their predecessors assumed oil shocks were temporary, kept rates low, and spent years unable to unwind the inflation that followed. MIT Nobel economist Simon Johnson said the Hormuz Strait simply has to be reopened. IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva offered a precise formula. Every 10% rise in oil prices, if sustained, adds 0.4 percentage points to global inflation and cuts world output by up to 0.2%. Oil is up roughly 38% since February 28th. Apply that formula and the numbers compound quickly, particularly for emerging markets with little fiscal room to absorb the hit. On the night of February 27th, one day before the strikes, Oman's foreign minister told the world a breakthrough had been reached. Peace, he said, was within reach. Iran had agreed to never stockpile enriched uranium to full IAEA verification, and to downgrade its current stockpile to the lowest level possible. Talks were set for Geneva on March 2nd. The strikes began on February 28th. The Geneva meeting never happened. Envoy Steve Witkoff had insisted on zero enrichment. Iran's position was that enrichment was an inalienable right. That single gap was not bridged before the clock ran out. When asked this week how the war ends, Witkoff told CNBC, "I don't know. That is not a diplomatic slip. It reflects genuine strategic ambiguity at the center of this conflict." Iranian President Pezeshkian formally named Iran's conditions for the first time this week: recognition of Iran's rights, payment of war reparations, and firm international guarantees against future attack. Trump's position, stated from the White House podium, remains unconditional surrender, defined as the moment Trump determines Iran's military objectives have been fully met. He decides when it is over, not Iran. That gap, Iran's three conditions versus Trump's self-defined finish line, is not a negotiating gap. It is a structural impasse Saudi Arabia has privately offered to mediate, according to Al Jazeera sources, a country that was itself targeted by Iranian missiles in the first week of this conflict. Oman, which brokered the original 2015 nuclear framework talks, has made its channels available. China and Russia are reported to be engaged in mediation efforts. No formal talks are scheduled as of March 13th. No off-ramp is visible on today's timeline. Reserve releases by weeks, not months. Navy escorts are not yet operationally ready. Insurance will not return until ships can transit safely. Safe transit requires a political resolution that does not yet exist. The Strait of Hormuz has been open for the entire modern history of global trade. Every prior threat to close it ended before it became reality, because Iran always had something left to lose. What is structurally different on March 13th, 2026 is that the calculation, what Iran has left to lose, has changed faster and further than most analysis mapped before February 28th. And the consequences of that change are already in the economic data, in the price of oil, in the freight rates, in the mortgage market, in the Fed's impossible position, and in the silence of tanker captains who are not moving because no insurance desk in the world will cover them if they try.